Always.
So tell me about classical conditioning. What is classical conditioning all about? Yeah.
Is it when you take an unconditioned stimulus or response? I don't know the difference between the two yet, sorry. And you take a conditioned one and you like get a response from it. I don't know what I'm going with this.
I think you're getting close. Yeah.
Where you condition a reaction or response to stimuli.
Okay. Voluntary or involuntary? All right, involuntary, right? Okay, so let's take a step back. What are those 4 key components? The unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. In classical conditioning, what does unconditioned mean? It's natural. It's unlearned. What does conditioned mean? It's learned. Okay, so tell me about Pavlov's first sort of experiments that he was conducting and how these key components relate to that original design.
Whenever he would feed his dogs, he would ring the bell and they would start salivating whenever they heard the sound of the bell. Instead of they knew that food was coming because of the bell and not because of the food itself.
Okay, so give me the 4 key components in this design.
You should ask somebody else.
All right, give me the 4. give me the 4 key components in what Pavlov was doing. Or let me do it this way. What was the unconditioned stimulus? The food, right? Unconditioned stimulus, sort of unlearned. And then what's the unconditioned response these dogs had? Salivating, right? They're drooling in the presentation or in the presence of food. Okay, so what's the conditioned stimulus? The bell, right? What's happening is it's being paired consistently over and over and over with the food. The dogs are learning to make this association, right? Acquisition is when the learning process is happening. So the conditioned response then is what? Salivating, right? So we have unconditioned stimulus, the food, an unconditioned response, salivating to the presentation of the food. A conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, what the dogs learned to make that association with through its frequent pairing with the food. So eventually, when you ring the bell and you don't present the food, you still have that sort of salivating response in the dogs. They've learned to have that response. Okay, good. So all this is sort of involuntary. Today we're going to talk about things that happen sort of on under our sort of free will, right? Voluntary behaviors and voluntary responses that we have. So operant conditioning is all about how we engage in voluntary behavior. We learn through the consequences that we should behave or should not behave in particular ways. So operant conditioning is sort of contrasted with classical conditioning in this sort of key way. Classical conditioning is all about sort of involuntary behaviors. Operant conditioning, it's all about voluntary behaviors that we engage in, right? When I act, does it bring about a pleasant consequence, something I like, or does it bring about some unpleasant consequence, something that I don't like? If I like the consequence that I get as a result of this behavior, what does that mean for the odds of me behaving similarly in the future? I'm going to do it, right? If I engage in a behavior that's followed by an unpleasant consequence, what does that mean for the likelihood of me engaging in that behavior in the future? I won't. Right? I was like, wait a second, that wasn't a complicated question. Right? I'm not likely to engage in that behavior in the future. All of this comes from Thorndike's idea of law of effect. When we engage in a particular behavior, and it's followed by something we like, it's followed by a pleasurable consequence, it will tend to be repeated, meaning that we are likely to behave in that manner again, right? It brought about something that we liked. If I engage in a behavior and it brings about some unpleasant consequence, I'm not likely to repeat that behavior in the future, right? I'm not likely to do it again in the future. Law of effect. What happens as a result of the behavior I engage in? Pleasant or unpleasant consequence? So thinking back to chapter 1, when we started talking about a lot of the movements in psychology, behaviorists wanted to sort of only look at observable behavior, right? They thought that we should be focusing on things that are overt, the things that we can see, the things that people do, the actions and behaviors that people engage in. Why did we see this behaviorist movement in psychology? What was this movement in reaction to? It's that rainy day. Okay. Looking at the sequence, tell me what the definition of psychology is. Let's do it that way. Tell me what psychology is. Scientific study, I'll help you. Scientific study of behavior and what? Mental processes, right? All right, so here we're talking about what? Observable behaviors, right? Previous movements in psychology focused on mental processes, the things going on in the mind. The behaviorist movement was a sort of counter-reaction to that, saying that we'll never really be able to get inside the minds of people. We should be focusing on the things that we can see, the things that are easily measurable, like the behaviors that people engage in. So this behaviorist movement gave operant conditioning its name. Operant, right? Sort of under your control. Behavior that we engage in that is sort of voluntary. We're doing it because we want to do it. Learning here is all about what happens after we behave, right? So what is the consequence of our actions? So in this sort of operant conditioning paradigm, okay, it's all about what happens as a result of our response or our behaviors, okay? What happens, what's the consequence? So looking back at Skinner boxes, right? So what was Skinner doing with the rats? Sometimes shocking them. Yeah, so the rat pushes the lever and receives some food pellets. Right? What happens eventually for the rat? It learns what? Push the lever, right? I'm going to get some food if I push the lever. Right? Voluntary behavior. They're engaging in that behavior to obtain a reward. Okay, so reinforcement. When we're talking about reinforcement, we're talking about any event or stimulus that someone receives, right? So after they behave, they receive something that's going to increase the likelihood that they will engage in that behavior again. Some of you might not be old enough to have potty trained a kid yet, but what do you know about how some parents choose to potty train their kids? Okay, sticker chart. Any kind of reward? Yeah.
They're really excited and like happy and make a big deal if they do it. Like they use the bathroom.
All right. So a lot of times parents will use like M&Ms or Skittles or something, right? Kid uses the toilet. High five. Here's some Skittles, right? We are rewarding that behavior. Do we want them to engage in that behavior in the future? Yes, right? So we're rewarding them for engaging in that behavior, right? So reinforcements increase the likelihood that a person or an animal is going to engage in that behavior again in the future, right? Primary reinforcers are things that meet some basic biological need for us. So the rat that's pressing the lever is meeting some basic biological need here. It's eating, it's getting food, right? So primary reinforcers help some sort of a biological need that we have, whether it's hunger, so we're getting food as a result, we're getting a water or something to drink, or for infants, maybe like something like touch, right, to being held, and that is a primary reinforcer for them. Secondary reinforcers are any reinforcer that becomes reinforcing because of what it allows us to do, okay? Whether it's praise, it feels good to be praised. Tokens, right? So getting tokens in school for kids that maybe have a behavioral problem in school. Every time they engage in a behavior that we want them to engage in, we give them a token. And then on Fridays, what can they do? All right, cash in your tokens, right? Pick something out of the treasure box or whatever it is, right? Basic ideas for rewarding behavior that we want them to engage in. Gold stars, giving kids gold stars. So positive reinforcement is any reinforcement that adds something to the situation, right? It causes some pleasurable experience, and we've added something here to the situation. Negative reinforcement is going to increase the likelihood that we engage in a behavior in the future because it's going to remove something that's unpleasant for us, right? Or we're trying to avoid some unpleasant stimulus. So go back to positive reinforcement. When we are working with kids, right, trying to get them to use the toilet, how is this positive reinforcement? They like the reward. I'm introducing something here, right? Adding something to what's going on here. So I'm giving my kids M&Ms or Skittles or something, right? They want those, so they're likely to engage in that behavior in the future. When you have a headache and you take aspirin or ibuprofen, Motrin, something like this, why do we do that? To remove that unpleasant situation, right? To remove our headache. It works, yes? So the next time you have a headache, what are you likely to do? Take it again, right? Okay, so positive reinforcement, something is being added, okay? Like a reward of some kind to increase the likelihood that you will engage in that behavior in the future. For negative reinforcement, we're taking something away. So sometimes I may have used this in the past. If your mom is nagging you to do the dishes, why do you do the dishes? To get mom to stop it, right? To remove the nagging mom from the situation. Positive or negative reinforcement? Negative reinforcement. You're removing something unpleasant, your mom, from the situation, okay? So you have to think about this. Reinforcement, every time we talk about reinforcement, we're talking about increasing the likelihood that someone's going to engage in a behavior again in the future. Positive and negative reinforcement do the exact same thing in terms of increasing the likelihood that we'll engage in a behavior in the future. But how it works is different between the two. Positive reinforcement, something is added here. Negative reinforcement, something is taken away. So when we talk about heroin becoming so problematic for people, or a lot of different types of painkillers that people become addicted to, how is it reinforcing? Positive or negative over time? Yeah.
Negative.
How?
Because whenever they feel something unpleasant, like stress or something in their life, they take it like aspirin.
Okay, all right. Remember we talked about the pain. Good. Remember the pain that we talked about that's associated with withdrawal of heroin. Yes? So why would somebody who's experiencing intense pain use a little bit of heroin again? To take it away, right? To take away that pain. So something like addiction to painkillers can be negative reinforcing for people, okay? It's taking away something very unpleasant from the environment. Okay, so if you've ever wondered how they get animals to do the things they do at like SeaWorld, right? Or how they train dogs to help people who need assistance in some way. They do it through a process of shaping, where they're being reinforced for the behaviors that they engage in. Along the way, though, we have the ultimate behavior that we want these animals to engage in. We figure out the process through which we need to engage to get them to perform these behaviors. We need to shape that behavior in those animals. So what happens is they figure out all the simple steps in the behavior that need to occur for these animals, okay? And they start rewarding each of those successive steps. So every time a simple step is engaged in, the animal is rewarded in some way, so that over time they're able to engage in these more complex behaviors. Stuff like this doesn't happen overnight, right? It's the process of training is through the shaping, the successive approximations. Every time they add another small step in the process that we want them to engage in to reach these final behaviors, we reward those successive steps. You with me? So it's a pretty intense process to get these animals to do these sorts of things. You have to shape that behavior in them, figuring out all the small steps that need to occur and rewarding each of those individual steps along the way. Okay. Extinction can occur, right? If we don't sort of reward that behavior, if it's not reinforced, somebody could stop engaging in that behavior. So the child who's rewarded for using the toilet, every time they use the toilet, they get a reward of some kind. What happens if you take that reward away? Yeah. So what are they not going to do? They'll use the bathroom. They just won't, not in the toilet, right? Little protest. I want my Skittles, right? So when that behavior, that's one of the problems, right? Is that when we have these behaviors that aren't rewarded, and they have been continuously, when you stop the reward, you can stop the likelihood that somebody engages in that behavior. We talked a little bit about generalization of some of the stimuli related to classical conditioning with what happened to little Albert, right? Learned to fear the white rabbit or the white rat, whatever it was, and then he showed this sort of stimulus generalization, where anything that sort of resembled this initial stimulus that they became frightened of elicited this conditioned response in them, right? The same thing can happen with operant conditioning. So the child who is praised for saying dada or mama, right? It feels good for parents. So they reward them, they praise them for engaging in this behavior. But all of a sudden, every man becomes dada, right? Feels good to be praised by your parents. Yes, it still does, I promise you, right? When you're in your early 30s, it will still feel good when you know that you're doing things that make your parents proud, okay? These things feel good for people. If you're a dad and your kid's calling other people dada, that doesn't feel too good, right? But that stimulus generalization, right? They've been rewarded for this behavior. They will do it sort of wrong. But they're showing that same sort of generalization that we see with classical conditioning. All right, so operant conditioning here. The end result for reinforcement is an increase in the rate of a behavior that somebody is already engaging in, right? Increasing the frequency and the likelihood with which somebody is going to engage in this behavior in the future. The end result for classical conditioning is the creation of a new response, right? Remember, they're learning through acquisition here, a sort of conditioned response here for classical conditioning. So we're creating a new response to some stimulus that did not produce this in the beginning, right? That neutral stimulus takes on a meaning. It becomes a conditioned stimulus in classical conditioning. With operant conditioning, the behaviors, the responses that people engage in are voluntary, right? They're choosing to engage in these behaviors. For classical conditioning, these things are happening sort of reflexively and a reflexive nature in people, right? They're sort of involuntary. They're elicited by the stimulus outside of our control. We're not voluntarily engaging in these actions. For operant conditioning, the consequences are important in forming an association. It's all about what happens after I engage in this particular action. Is it a positive consequence or is it a negative consequence for me? Here for classical conditioning, the antecedent stimuli become important in forming that association. The bell, the food presented, right? That sort of pairing, that association is what's really important in classical conditioning. For operant conditioning, reinforcement should be immediate. If you're going to train an animal in that sort of shaping to engage in this complex behavior at the end, you have to reward that behavior immediately. The exact opposite occurs if you're going to sort of punish a dog for something. Like the dog pees on the floor while you're at work. You don't know how long ago the dog peed on the floor, but when you come home, you grab the dog and you shove its nose into its urine on the floor. Not a good move. What's the problem? The dog has no idea what you're doing here, right? The time that it pissed on the floor and the time that you came home was probably too great of a time for you to punish that behavior by the time you got home, right? So in increasing this, the reinforcement for the behavior that we want should be immediate. Yes?
Even if it's like far apart, like if you take the dog to the pee and then hit him, you think he'll know?
You know, dogs are not the most intelligent animals on the planet, right? It needs to be immediate. In classical conditioning, the conditioned stimuli or stimulus must occur immediately before the unconditioned stimulus. So the bell and the food, very close in time with one another. For operant conditioning, we have this expectancy that develops, right? When I engage in this behavior, this is the pleasurable consequence that occurs when I do. For classical conditioning, this expectancy develops for the unconditioned stimulus to follow the conditioned stimulus. The bell means food, right? That sort of cognitive rationalization for why it is that classical conditioning occurs. All right, spontaneous recovery is an issue that we talked about with classical conditioning. We see it here as well. Reoccurrence of what we thought was a once extinguished response. We thought it was gone, but all of a sudden it happens again. So many of you have probably been in the grocery store where you see like, well, this isn't somebody's kitchen, but in the grocery store aisle, right? Checking out what happens when the kid sees all the candy in the aisle. You've seen it, yes? What do these kids do? And everybody in the supermarket knows that that kid really wants that candy bar, right? They cause a major scene. What's the easiest way for a parent to alleviate this situation? Buy it, right? Shut them up. If I buy it for them, they'll shut up. It's embarrassing. I promise you it's embarrassing. It'll cross your mind like, I should just end this now, right? If I just buy a candy bar, little dude will shut up. People will stop looking at me, right? Is that a wise behavior?
No.
Why?
Because you're basically telling your kid you can do whatever you want and you can get your way as long as you do good afterwards.
Good. So now use the language that we've been talking about so far today in your explanation. Why is this problematic? Got to buy my groceries first. Okay. Is the kid getting what they want? Yes. Increasing the likelihood that they will engage in that behavior in the future. Okay? So when you're back in the supermarket and little man throws a fit, what is little man thinking? I got it last time. This is what happens. I act like this and I get what I want. Right? So the easiest solution for a parent is to just give the child what it wants. He or she wants. I hate it when I say it for referring to a child. Okay. Gives he or she what they want. Easiest action here to alleviate this situation, but it is the most problematic action that a parent can engage in. We are reinforcing that behavior. They're getting what they want. Increasing the likelihood that they will engage in that action in the future, right? So one way to deal with a child's temper tantrum of this manner is to completely ignore it, right? What you want to see is the lack of reinforcement here will eventually result in extinction in that behavior. If I thought my child has sort of stopped these temper tantrums and they do it again, spontaneous recovery, and I cave again, I've only started to reinforce that behavior. You with me? All right. So how should we be reinforcing people or animals for the behaviors that they engage in? What's the sort of best way to go about reinforcing people or animals? The partial reinforcement effect is a tendency for a response or behavior that is engaged in that is reinforced some of the time, but not all of the time, to be very resistant to extinction. So if you think about what we're saying here with the partial reinforcement is that when the child uses the bathroom, uses the toilet successfully, sometimes he or she is going to be rewarded in some way. So they get their Skittles, they get their M&Ms, and sometimes they're not. Why would that sort of schedule of reinforcement, this partial reinforcement idea, be more prone to or be more resistant to something like extinction?
Because they don't get it every single time.
They don't get it every single time. So if we were doing the continuous reinforcement, where we do reinforce them each and every time they engage in that behavior that we want to see, right? That as soon as we don't, we can see something like extinction here. As soon as we stop rewarding or reinforcing that behavior, they might start to sort of lean towards stop engaging in that behavior. So reinforcement that occurs sort of intermittently. We're not sure if I pee in the toilet, if this time my dad's going to give me a Skittle or not. Maybe it's the next time, right? That sort of idea, right, is much more resistant to extinction than when I get reinforced every single time I engage in the behavior. You with me? Because every time I reinforce this kid for this behavior, you can't reinforce them forever. You're not reinforced anymore. You're not, extinction is always a concern because as soon as you stop it, they might stop doing it as well. Okay, so different types of reinforcement patterns that we can see. The fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement is a pattern where we are reinforced after we have engaged in a specific number of responses, right? So we have to engage in this number of responses before we are rewarded, right? So when Subway had their Subway card, I don't even think they do it anymore.
I'm assuming you buy so many subs and then you get one.
Yeah, I don't think they do it anymore, actually. They don't do it here. They did it in California. Right, okay, so if you buy 12 subs, you get your 13th sub free, okay? What's happening is I know what my reward is, a free sub. And I have this many times I have to buy, this many times I have to engage in this behavior of buying a Subway sandwich till I get a free one. I'm trying to think of, there's like coffee places that do this too, right? You buy 10 coffees, your 11th cup of coffee is free, okay? You are rewarding people for engaging in that behavior in a fixed ratio schedule. If you do this a specific number of times, you will be rewarded. You with me? All right, so that schedule has a certain number of times somebody has to engage in a response or a behavior before they get rewarded. The variable interval schedule of reinforcement, reinforcement in which the interval of time that passes before we become reinforced can be different from each trial or event. Right? Why are pop quizzes so successful in making sure that students stay up on reading or studying?
They don't know when they're gonna have the quiz, so they study for a potential quiz.
All right, good. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to reward you for staying up on the course material of the pop quiz, right? The problem is you have no idea when you get to be rewarded for your behaviors, right? You aren't sure whether you'll be rewarded, right? Whether you would potentially do well on a quiz, if it's today, if it's Thursday, if it's next Tuesday, if it's next Thursday. That amount of time that has to pass varies. It's different from one moment to the next, okay? Or you calling your friend and you get a busy signal. You hang up, you call again. You hang up, you call again. You hang up, you call again. Why? You keep going to the answer. You're not sure how long you're going to keep getting this busy signal. Right? You're not sure how much time needs to pass before before your behavior is rewarded. You get the person that you're trying to call on the line. Fixed interval schedules, we get reinforced after a specific interval of time, a specific amount of time passes. Right? But that time is always the same. Right? So I get paid the first of every month. I know how much time has to pass exactly before I get paid, right? Or you get paid every other Friday. You know when you are going to be rewarded for your behaviors, when you get paid for whatever it is that you do, right? A specific set amount of time. First of every month, every other Friday, every other Monday, whatever it is, okay? A specific amount of time passes and you get rewarded. The variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, where reinforcement happens after a specific number of responses are engaged in. But we don't know how many responses we need to engage in before we get rewarded. Why do slot machines work so well in reeling people in? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know when it's going to hit. I don't know when it's going to hit. I can't walk away from this machine. I've been sitting here for 2 hours. What if I walk away, that old lady sits down and wins it, hits the jackpot, right? I sit here and I keep putting money in that machine because you don't know, right? That's how slot machines work. There's a guy on NPR who does what's today? Today's a Tuesday, right? So every Tuesday morning, Shankar Vedantam is his name. He does like social science correspondence for NPR. And this morning he was talking about work that's being done on why gambling is so addictive. And it's not just the wins that make people happy, it's the almost wins that make people happy. So he's talking about slot machines where you're supposed to get like 3 of the same symbols and you win, right? The times when people get 2 of the same symbols, but the third one's different, right? That in and of itself is so exciting to people, that's enough to keep them going, right? The almost wins are just as sort of exciting for humans than they are for other animals. And they talked about research being done with animals that suggests that animals don't fall victim to that almost win. Now, that's sort of a human issue, how reinforcing these almost wins are. Animals care about whether they win or they don't. We take pride and excitement in our almost wins. Okay. Okay, so reinforcement increases the likelihood that someone's going to engage in a specific behavior in the future. Punishment is all about decreasing the likelihood that someone's going to engage in a particular behavior in the future. Right? So punishment is when we engage in a particular behavior and it's followed by an unpleasant consequence, right? Something that we don't like. Decreasing the likelihood that we will engage in that behavior in the future. All right, so these terms, punishment by application and punishment by removal are kind of the modern way that people are talking about it. We used to talk about it as positive punishment and negative punishment. People would be like, what? Like, positive punishment? All right, which is punishment by application, and negative punishment, removal. Same ideas with reinforcement that threw people off. So punishment by application is where we punish a behavior, punish a response that somebody has engaged in by adding something to the environment. All right, so the positive idea is we're adding something here to the environment. So what type of punishment might somebody do that adds something to the environment? What do parents do where they add something to the environment? Yeah. Okay. All right. So you're bitching about the dishes, but now you have to mow the yard too. Right? Okay. What else? Yeah.
I'm sorry, say that question again. I had the first one.
What do parents do when they do this sort of punishment by application?
You said
Right?
after the environment, right?
Yeah.
Whenever I was little, I used to come to mom and say, "Karma, give me something to grab out," and then I just stopped.
So it was the threat of punishment by application. So this is good. What was mom suggesting to you?
Stop before it gets worse.
All right. What was the worst? What was the doomsday scenario that mom was
But it's like that, y'all mad at me.
spanking? All right. So here, right, is another example of punishment by application, a spanking of some kind, right? They're adding something unpleasant to the environment, right? Decreasing the likelihood that little Miles is going to engage in that behavior again in the future, right? All right, punishment by removal, where we take something away. So we want to decrease the likelihood that somebody's going to engage in that behavior again in the future. We're going to remove something from the environment, take something away from you, right? How do parents use this? Yeah. Okay, take away toys, take away games, take away TV privileges, right? Taking away something that the kid wants, right? So maybe when you were younger, there was a lot of punishment by application. But as you were older, there was probably more punishment by removal. If you came home drunk, right? How might your parents handle this situation? All right, take away the car, you're grounded, right? So loss of some of the privileges that you have, right? It feels good to be able to use the car. It feels good to be able to go out on the weekends. Because you came home drunk, your parents say, guess what? Not anymore, right? Some set amount of time. You can't go out for 6 months, whatever it is, right? All right, so punishment by removal, taking away something pleasant from people. All right, so how do we make punishment more effective? Punishment should be immediate, right? So it should follow the behavior that it is meant to punish. So again, with the dog, right? Where the dog pees on the floor, you come home hours later and you shove that dog's nose into the pee. Right? Punishment has to be immediate. Punishment should be consistent, right? So if sometimes a particular behavior is punished and other times it is not punished, why does this create a sort of problem situation for kids or animals? What's that? All right, they're not getting the message, right? They're not sure what they did differently. They're not sure, like, last time this was fine. Why am I being punished for this this time? Some of these things, like immediate and like, can change as kids get older, right? So my mom's famous line was like, "Wait till your dad gets home," and then I sat all day like, "Oh man, like what's it gonna be? What's it gonna be when he gets here?" Right? It wasn't immediate, but it was coming. Like, kids can rationalize that later. You with me? Punishment of the wrong behavior should be paired, whenever possible, with sort of reinforcement of the right behavior. So rather than simply punishing a kid for a behavior that they shouldn't be engaging in, you should also, when you have the opportunity, reinforce the right behavior. So when they engage in the things that we want them to behave, the behaviors that we want them to engage in, we praise, we reinforce those behaviors. So it's not just about punishing the sort of negative behaviors that somebody engages in, but also reinforcing all the times that the child is engaging in this sort of positive behavior, the things that we want our children to do. So punishment has several drawbacks, right? Particularly severe punishment. Severe punishment can cause people to sort of engage in this avoidant behavior, where they start avoiding the person who administers the punishment. So if dad is always spanking the child, right? Child learns to sort of avoid dad, to stay away from dad because they start seeing him as the sort of the punisher, right? Instead of the behavior being sort of punished, they are engaging in this avoidance behavior of the person who does the punishing. It may encourage lying. Right? If I know what the sort of severe punishment is that I'm going to get, I am just going to lie about the behaviors that I'm engaging in so that they don't know. And if they don't know, they won't punish me. And it can create fear and anxiety. We become fearful and anxious around somebody who's punishing me in some particular way. Right? So the severe punishment has several big drawbacks to it. All right, so 4 different ways that we can modify behavior in people. Right? So positive, we add something to the environment. So reinforcement, we give something valued or something desirable to increase the likelihood that they'll engage in the behavior. Like getting a gold star for good behavior in school. We want you to engage in this behavior, so we give it to you. Something unpleasant, right, is punishment by positive or add punishment by application. We are adding something to the situation that is unpleasant. So getting a spanking for disobeying, right? We've added something uncomfortable to that situation. At my kids' school, they do this kind of cool thing where it's in the Mount Lebanon district, so the schools are kind of small and the lunchrooms are even smaller. There's no like active area where they make lunches. They bring them in from like I think the high school to the different schools. So not all the kids eat at the same time. They have to come like in waves. And if you do something good, you can get like a token that you can cash in to have a friend come and eat with you. My older son got a star or whatever, a token of some kind, and he was like, now I can take Colin, my middle son, to lunch. He can actually eat with my friends and I. I was like, that is awesome behavior. Right. I should have reinforced it. Okay, so negative reinforcement, right? We are removing or taking something away in order to with reinforcement to increase the likelihood that they're going to engage in that behavior in the future. So take away something unpleasant, right? So avoiding a ticket by stopping at a red light. Punishment, negative punishment, or punishment by removal. Losing privileges, such as going out with your friends, right? Something you like is taken away from you. Okay, examples of negative reinforcement. Stop at a red light to avoid getting in an accident. We mail in our income tax return by April 15th so we can avoid paying that penalty for late filing. We obey a parent before the parent reaches the count of 3 to avoid getting a scolding. I hate it when people count to 3. My brothers do this. They're like, they'll look at their kids and be like, 1, 2. I'm like, no. You don't get 3 more seconds to act like this. I'm telling you to stop. You stop it now. I'm not giving you like 3 more seconds for you to do this. No? Okay. So examples of punishment by removal: losing the privilege of driving because you got into too many accidents, or having to lose some of your money to pay the penalty for late tax filing. Being grounded, so losing your freedom for being disobedient towards your parents in some particular way. In operant conditioning, we also see things like discriminative stimulus, where any stimulus, such as a stop sign or doorknob, right? It gives us a clue for how we should make a very specific response. Doorknobs are all different, but we understand how to use the doorknob, right? We know exactly what this sort of stimulus is and how to effectively navigate the situation to be successful. So we talked a little bit about shaping. And looking at some of the things that animals do, there are times when operant conditioning doesn't work on animals. There's this sort of instinctive drift, this sort of tendency for the behaviors that an animal engages in to revert back to what look like these sort of genetically controlled patterns of behavior that they engage in. Right? Animals come into this world and our labs with very specific genetically determined instinctive behaviors that they engage in. Right? Many of these instincts are going to be different from species to species. When people try to work with these behaviors, there are some responses that simply cannot be trained in animals. Right? Regardless of the amount of conditioning that we apply in these situations, some of these animals seem completely unable to learn these things. Raccoons. Right? Raccoons are actually a very smart animal. What they do is they will commonly dunk their food in and out of water before they eat. Good behavior. Right? They're cleaning the food before they engage in it. This sort of washing behavior that they engage in seems to be controlled by instinct. it is really difficult to change, even with some of the basic operant conditioning techniques that we've talked about. So one of the things they tried to do with raccoons is get them to take tokens, put tokens in a tin can, and get rewarded with food. Right? The first few trials seem to go okay, but before long, these raccoons will take the coin, they'll dunk it like it's food, and then not drop it in the tin can. Give them 2 coins, they start dunking the food as if they're the coins as if they're washing it, rubbing together, and not dropping them in the tin can. Right? No matter what happens here, they revert back to that sort of genetically programmed behavior that they engage in. It's very difficult to sort of, even with operant conditioning, to train these animals not to engage in these instinctual behaviors. All right, so think for a second. How can we use operant conditioning to play a positive role in behavior modification amongst people? What can we do? Yes.
If someone want to do something for themselves, like give them something that job so they don't have to do it, like change their behavior.
Okay. So try to make behaviors like intrinsically rewarding?
Like every time you do this, this happens and that's bad, so you should change it. But you don't say anything else, but that makes someone want to do it.
Okay. Okay. So reward an alternative behavior maybe? Well, how else do we do this? Yeah.
Could grades be like you give them good grades when they do their work and do good work, and then like when it's obvious that they did it, they get bad grades?
Yes, right? When you do good work, you can be rewarded with good grades. When you turn in and submit poor work, you get poor grades. Right? What else do we do? Classroom is a great place to talk about and look at operant conditioning. Okay. Maybe you are, I will walk you through a scenario. Maybe you're a school psychologist and you have a child in 3rd grade who is routinely disrupting the classroom, right? He's hitting other kids around him or her, causing the teacher to stop many times throughout the day to address this child. You are a school psychologist. That teacher comes to you and says, I need help. Little Timmy is being aggressive in class, and I'm unsure what to do to change his classroom behavior. What could you do? Yes. Okay. You can make him sit by himself, not around somebody. A timeout.
Like if he's disrupting the class or whatever, and then we usually have like some type of recess or something, like take away that privilege.
Okay, all right. So we have kids who love recess, right? I ask my kids, what was the best thing about school today? And they say recess. I'm like, best thing about school inside, gym. I'm out of questions now. What's the best academic thing you did in class today? All right, right. So kids look forward to that. So if you act up in class, you lose the privilege to go outside and play recess. All right. What else? Can't hit in school.
Parent-teacher conference.
All right, parent-teacher conference. All right, bring parents in to talk about the situation and what's going on. Good. Okay, I'll use this example as we go through this. Behavior modification is when we use the basic techniques of operant conditioning to bring about a change in behavior. So if the kid is disruptive in the classroom, we could set up something like a token economy with them, right? Where we have this behavior modification program that we are going to implement with this kid. Every time they engage in desired behaviors, we reward them with tokens. Every time they do something we don't want them to do, they're going to lose one of their tokens. Yeah.
Would you want to do that with the entire class or just the kid that you're having problems with?
The kid you're having problems with is the focus of this, right?
So but would that be like singling him out? So that would be the best to like single
The other kids in the classroom don't always have to know what's going on,
Okay.
right? So I think is the example I use, right? So this kid is being disruptive. let's say every time, if we think about the day is split up in two, morning day and afternoon day. Every time in the morning we go a series without you disrupting the class, you get a gold star, right? Every afternoon we go and you haven't disrupted the class, you get a gold star. Every time I have to stop and address something that you were doing, you lose a gold star. On Fridays, you'll have the ability to cash in your stars to get whatever you want, right? So it's sort of token economy. It works really well with kids. We could use timeout. Yeah. Was that your question? Right. You're not going to have them next year. No, you're wrong. No, that is always the concern, right? That is always the concern, that once these kids... So eventually what we're trying to do is that they just learn proper classroom behaviors. Timeouts, right? So why do we do timeouts? How are they effective? It's a sort of mild punishment, right? We are going to remove the kid, right? This misbehaving kid is removed from the situation that is usually rewarding for them, right? So the kid who's acting up in class and gets everybody in the class to laugh with him. What is reinforcing for this kid about this behavior? He's getting the attention from other kids. Other kids are laughing with him. If we need to remove him from that situation, pick him up and literally move him away from that situation. That situation in and of itself becomes rewarding for them, right? Kids goofing off together. You punish your kid. You remove him or her from what's going on, right? So we're trying to get them away from any sources that might be positively reinforcing for them, right? We don't want them to engage in this behavior, so we need to remove it. Applied behavior analysis. We have an applied behavior analysis master's program at Cal now. It's a modern term for behavior modification. It uses things like some of the shaping techniques that we've talked about to sort of mold the behaviors that we want to see people engage in. It's used a lot with kids who have autism, right? Where they have a tendency to not sort of look people in the eye, not wanting to be around other individuals. In this applied behavior analysis, we can use rewards to sort of try and reinforce the positive behaviors that we want them to engage in. So we're teaching them social skills, right? Teaching them how to communicate with other individuals. The applied behavior analysis, we reward those behaviors that we want them to engage in, right? Trying to teach them good social skills, right? Applied behavior analysis. You can provide biofeedback or neurofeedback. They do this a lot with some anger management programs. Biofeedback is people are taught to learn about some of the biological conditions that can bring about sort of involuntary responses, right? Blood pressure going up in individuals. For times when they feel like they might be experiencing these things, right? Learning to understand the reaction in their body. They need to try and sort of relax. Bring their body under the sort of voluntary control a little bit. Using the sort of symptoms, biological symptoms, people try to control what's going on. Neurofeedback, this sort of biofeedback, we actually use brain imaging devices to show people the brain activity that's associated with particular behaviors, to encourage them to not engage in those particular behaviors in the future. Literally, when you do this, these are the sort of brain patterns that we see, and they are not good. You need to stop this sort of behavior that you're engaging in. All right, some of the early work on cognitive learning theory. Again, that focus was all on behavior. In the 50s, more intensely in the 1960s, many psychologists became aware that cognition, right? So the sort of mental events that take place inside a person's mind while behaving could no longer be ignored. We can't think about this black box as something that we'll never get into. Edward Tolman was one of the early workers in this area, and his studies became pretty famous because he started looking at things like latent learning. Okay, so this is what he would do. He would have three groups of rats who are going to run a maze. Group 1 is rewarded every time they complete the maze, right? So every time they complete the maze, they get rewarded. They learned the maze really quickly, right? They were flying through that maze and were receiving the reward very quickly. So group 2, they're in the maze every day, just like group 1, but they're only rewarded starting on day 10. So the first 9 days that they're in this maze, they're not rewarded. Group 3 is never rewarded. Right? They did not learn the maze well. Group 2, go back here. So they run the maze for 10 days. They're not rewarded the first 9 days. They demonstrated learning of the maze immediately after receiving their reward. Tolman started talking about this as latent learning, that we can learn. We have information, we have knowledge, but that knowledge or that learning doesn't manifest itself until the application using that knowledge becomes useful. So something like this, right? The start box, the rat's got to get through the maze and get here. So here's the sequence of events. If we look at the days as they unfold, the red line is group 1. They're flying through the maze, right? So if this is the number of errors that they're making, they're flying through the maze. They're learning it very quickly, yes? The blue line is group 3. They're never rewarded and they're making a lot of mistakes. They're not learning the maze. But here's the interesting line, is this greenish yellow line. Right? They don't show a lot of knowing how this maze works until you start rewarding them. And then they show an incredible amount of learning. There was no reason for them to show that they learned this maze until they started receiving the reward. They knew it, but didn't have any reason to show it until they were being rewarded. You with me? So this latent learning is the idea that we are learning information, but we don't necessarily show it until showing it becomes sort of useful for us in some particular way. Insight moments are often looked at, right? So the sudden perception of how we can solve a particular problem. So we've been struggling with something, and we find the solution seems to come very quickly. Cannot be gained through trial and error alone. It's like this aha moment. I all of a sudden have figured out how to do something. They did a lot of this work with chimpanzees, right? They would put like a banana on a string in this room, and they'd put a series of boxes around and a stick in the room. So the chimpanzee goes to the stick and realizes that I can't get the stick, right? Grabs a box, tries to jump from the box to get the banana, can't do it. Sits down, and the videos are cool. And literally looks like an aha moment. Runs over, grabs a box, grabs the other box, puts it on top, stands on the boxes with his stick, swipes the banana down, problem solved, right? Those sort of aha moments. You're going to hate this. Learned helplessness is work that was done on dogs. And it's been used a lot to talk about people. What happens to people when we have sort of our lives are characterized by efforts I put in and nothing works. So repeated failures over and over and over. What Seligman started doing was this concept of learned helplessness. He was putting dogs on a floor that's going to shock them. If you put a dog in a room like this and shock the floor, what does the dog do? It jumps. It gets out. It jumps the little hurdle and gets away. What if you put 4 walls in here and just start shocking that floor? Escape is not possible for this dog. Eventually, what will that dog do? It will stop jumping and lay down, and it will take the shock. If you remove one of the 4 walls and there's a hurdle, so this dog can jump out, and you shock it, a dog that has developed learned helplessness will lay down on the floor and continue to take the shock, even when escape is possible. So learned helplessness is our tendency to fail to act, so we don't act or escape from a situation because we have this sort of history of repeated failures in the past. These dogs don't try to escape. And the idea of generalizing this work to people is controversial in and of itself. But the basic idea is, when we have these repeated failures, do we develop this sense of learned helplessness? The positive psychology movement is this new way where we look at mental health and therapy. The old approach in psychology, or historical approaches in psychology, have been all about what is wrong with people. What can we do to fix people and make them right? Okay? Positive psychology looks at things in a very different way. It focuses on adaptive. How best can we help people thrive in new environments? How can we tap into the creative potential of people? How can we encourage people to live more psychologically fulfilling lives? Right? How can we improve this human experience? Rather than focusing on mental disorders, what is wrong with people? How can we fix them? So positive psychology is, how can we take those things that are allowing people to thrive in their life and build upon them so that they can have the best human experience possible? All right, so another way that we learn is simply through observational learning. We watch how other people behave. We watch models, not like supermodels, but like models, right? Watching how other people behave. We model behavior for our kids. We can model behavior for our friends. If you're a mentor at Cal U, you are hopefully modeling good behavior for incoming students to this university, right? We learn through watching others. We can learn through watching others without sort of engaging in the behaviors on our own. So the sort of Bandura's Bobo doll experiment, right? Early work looking at the modeling of other people. What happens when kids see adults be aggressive? They're aggressive, right? So when we see these kids, or we see these adults that are aggressive. So what they did was they saw a model being aggressive. And then they put these kids in a room with a Bobo doll, right? The weighted doll that you can punch and it comes back up and you can punch it again, right? So they look to see what these kids do when interacting with this doll. Those kids who had watched an aggressive model engaged in aggressive behavior. And they said like classic 1950s stuff like, you know, this kid is like sock him in the nose, like when they're hitting him and stuff, right? But these kids are being aggressive after watching an aggressive model, right? They're learning to engage in particular behavior as a result of watching somebody else, okay? All right. Observational learning requires a few things. It requires us to be able to pay attention. To learn anything through simply observation, so through watching somebody else engage in it, we have to be paying attention, right? We have to see what it is that this person is doing. So the first step is attention. Is our attention on what this person is doing? Second is memory, right? So is the person going to be able to retain a memory for what has just happened? So let's say somebody's watching a cooking show and they're trying to get this recipe down. One, are they paying attention to the show? Yes, the show is on, but are they actually paying attention to the show itself? And two, are they going to be able to remember all the steps that they need to engage in for this particular cooking show? The third step, imitation. The learner must be capable of reproducing or imitating the actions that this person has engaged in. So can I imitate this person? The fourth is motivation. They have to have the desire to engage in the action, okay? Attention. Am I watching this person's behavior? Will I remember what this person is doing? Am I able to engage in that action? And do I have a desire to perform that action? So how could observational learning play a positive role in promoting pro-social behavior in kids? Yes.
If a kid sees like their parent handling a confrontation with someone else like in a more peaceful way, they'll be more likely to do that rather than just hit them.
Okay, all right. So a kid that sees his mom or dad, or her mom and dad, being able to navigate a confrontation with somebody else in a very nonviolent manner. Good. Yeah. That works really well with kids if they actually see that kid get punished. Right? So if I'm on the playground and I watch these kids get in an altercation, right? And that kid who is being violent, they receive a punishment that is severe, right? Witnessing that can decrease the likelihood that I will engage in that particular behavior. Does that make sense? So it's in line with what you said. All right, so a lot of times we talk about a lot of effects, right? So what happens to people after watching violence, right? They're imitating it. We become desensitized to it. It doesn't bother us over time. We tend to not focus on a lot of the pro-social effects, right? So people who model nonviolent behavior promote similar behavior in other individuals. So two of my heroes, right? Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, right? People who promoted social change through nonviolent behaviors and were able to sort of create a groundswell and movement encouraging people to engage in similar behaviors. Parents as models. So parents who read more have kids that read more. Parents who promote religious service or broader civic engagement generally have kids who engage in broader civic engagement. Parents who model humanitarian concerns, that we should care about one another. Even if you will never meet that person, what is happening over there can still affect us here in the United States. Right? So parents modeling those concerns have kids who develop broader humanitarian concerns. All right, so